The human mind was never designed to endure absolute isolation. We are creatures of community, built to thrive under the warmth of a yellow sun, surrounded by the familiar rustle of wind through trees and the comforting chatter of our own kind. But when you strip all of that away, when you submerge yourself into a place where the sun is nothing more than a structural myth, the brain begins to alter its own parameters. It starts looking for patterns in spaces where no patterns should exist. It manufactures a presence out of the empty air to save itself from the crushing weight of being truly, utterly alone. My name is Thomas, and I am an oceanographic research engineer specializing in deep-sea acoustics and automated underwater infrastructure. 2 years ago, I accepted a highly classified 6-month contract with a private marine tech firm. The assignment was as simple as it was mentally punishing. I was to live alone inside an experimental hyper-pressurized benthic habitat anchored directly to the jagged rock walls of the Puerto Rico Trench. The habitat, designated Station 7, sat at a depth of nearly 28,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Down there, the water pressure is a relentless, bone-crushing 8 tons per square inch. The only thing separating my fragile body from an instant, violent death was a multi-layered hull of experimental titanium alloy and reinforced optical glass 3 inches thick. Station 7 was entirely self-sustaining, powered by a localized geothermal tapping system anchored into a nearby hydrothermal vent field. My role was purely observational. The firm had deployed an array of ultra-sensitive hydrophones across the floor of the trench to record the low-frequency acoustic anomalies generated by tectonic plate friction. Every 24 hours, my job was to calibrate the acoustic receivers, ensure the automated data packages compressed correctly, and transmit the digital packets back up to the research vessel anchored miles above my head. The rest of the time was mine to kill. For the first 2 months, the isolation was manageable. The interior of the habitat was small, roughly the size of a commercial shipping container, split into 3 tightly optimized compartments. There was a compact galley and sleeping berth, a central engineering workspace lined with glowing diagnostic monitors, and an observation deck dominated by a single, circular viewport looking out into the ink-black expanse of the trench. To illuminate the void, the exterior of the habitat was outfitted with 4 industrial-grade high-intensity discharge floodlights. When switched on, they cut through the freezing, crystalline water, casting a stark, artificial beam across the gray, lifeless silt of the seabed and the jagged black basalt walls of the canyon. Apart from the occasional ghostly shape of a translucent snailfish or a swarming cloud of pale, blind amphipods drifting through the light beams, the view never changed. The abyssal plain was an eternal, silent desert, but the silence wasn't a soft, peaceful quiet. The habitat was constantly alive with an orchestra of mechanical noises. There was the rhythmic, metallic wheeze of the oxygen scrubbers, the high-pitched whine of the coolant pumps, and the deep, structural groan of the titanium hull as it subtly shifted against the immense weight of the ocean. You learn to read these sounds like a second language. You map your safety to their rhythm. It was during my 11th week on the station that the acoustics began to warp. I was sitting at the engineering console at roughly 2 in the morning, reviewing the daily frequency graphs. The hydrophones usually recorded a predictable baseline of sound, a steady, chaotic crackle of shifting sand, distant underwater earthquakes, and the faint clicks of migrating whales thousands of feet above. But as I scrolled through the visual waveforms captured by receiver delta, located 3 miles deeper into the northern axis of the trench, I noticed a clean, repeating spike in the data. It was a perfectly uniform sequence of acoustic bursts, 3 quick pulses, followed by a deliberate 5-second pause, and then another 3 pulses. It looked like an artificial signal. Intrigued, I plugged my studio headphones into the primary monitoring deck, isolated receiver delta's audio stream, and raised the gain. The audio wasn't a tectonic groan, and it wasn't the sound of a mechanical malfunction in the receiver array. It was a rhythmic, heavy thudding sound. It sounded exactly like someone striking a solid piece of metal with a padded mallet. Thump, 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 then a long, hollow silence, then again, thump, thump, thump. I checked the status of the remote monitoring equipment, thinking an autonomous surveyor drone from the surface vessel might have dropped an anchor or drifted into a rock wall. But the surface logs confirmed no operations were active. The tracking sensors showed absolutely nothing within 5 miles of Station 7. I stared at the visual waveform as it danced across my screen, trying to find a logical explanation. The ocean floor is a vast acoustic amplifier. Sound waves can travel thousands of miles through the dense, cold water without losing their clarity. I convinced myself that I was simply listening to a distant naval exercise or a commercial drilling operation occurring somewhere on the continental shelf. But over the next 3 days, the thumping sound didn't fade. It grew progressively louder, and it was migrating. By Thursday night, the sound was no longer exclusive to receiver Delta. It was being picked up by receiver Gamma, then Beta, drawing a straight, deliberate line across the trench floor toward the coordinates of Station 7. I could hear it now without even wearing my headphones. The thuds were echoing directly through the seawater, vibrating against the exterior of the titanium hull. Every 5 minutes, 3 dull, echoing impacts would reverberate through the steel beams beneath my feet. Thump, thump, thump. I contacted the surface crew via our daily text-based satellite uplink. I described the repeating acoustic anomaly and requested a structural diagnostic on our automated power lines, thinking a high-voltage cable might be snapping against a rocky ledge due to a deep-water current. 6 hours later, the reply from the surface director arrived on my terminal. Their response was cold, brief, and deeply unsettling. They stated that all external infrastructure was completely secure. They reminded me that at our specific coordinates, there were no documented deep-sea currents capable of moving heavy cables. The message ended with a reminder to monitor my oxygen levels, subtly implying that the isolation was finally getting to my head. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I lay down in my narrow bunk, the structural rhythm of the station would be shattered by those 3 deliberate thuds. It felt personal. It felt like someone was walking slow, heavy circles around the perimeter of my tiny titanium cage, testing the metal for a structural weakness. By the second week of the anomaly, the sound had arrived at the habitat. It was exactly 3 in the morning when the thumping stopped completely. The sudden absence of the noise was more jarring than the sound itself. The silence in the control room became suffocating, heavy with an agonizing anticipation. I stood up from my console, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, and walked slowly toward the observation deck. The circular viewport was dark, the exterior floodlights turned off to conserve energy during the automated data compression cycle. I reached for the manual override switch on the wall and flipped the floodlights on. The powerful beams of white light sliced through the black water, illuminating the abyssal desert outside. At first, everything looked completely normal. The gray sediment lay undisturbed, the black rock walls loomed in the distance, and the empty water columns drifted lazily past the glass. I let out a long, shaky breath, rubbing my tired eyes, preparing to turn the lights back off and crawl into bed. But then my gaze drifted to the very bottom edge of the thick glass viewport. Resting flat against the exterior structural frame of the window, completely illuminated by the harsh glare of the floodlights, was a shape. I dropped to my knees, pressing my face against the freezing glass, my eyes straining to make out the details through the dark water. It was a hand. It wasn't a claw, and it wasn't the fin of an undocumented deep-sea creature. It was a human hand. The skin was shockingly pale, almost translucent, completely devoid of any blood flow or pigment. The fingers were long, thin, and pressed firmly flat against the steel rim of the habitat's hull. The fingernails were dark, cracked, and worn away down to the raw bone. The hand was perfectly, unnaturally still, completely undisturbed by the immense, 8-ton hydraulic pressure of the deep ocean that should have crushed a human body into a microscopic paste in a fraction of a second. I staggered backward across the floor of the observation deck, my breath coming in ragged, frantic gasps, my mind completely fracturing under the impossibility of what I was seeing. No human being could survive outside at this depth without a specialized diving submersible. There were no air bubbles, no life support hoses, and no equipment visible. Just a naked, dead white hand clinging to the metal outside my window. As I watched from the safety of the interior hallway, the pale fingers began to move. They slid slowly, smoothly across the surface of the glass, leaving a faint, oily smudge on the outer pane. The hand moved upward until it reached the exact center of the circular viewport. Then it curled into a tight, pale fist. Thump, thump, thump. The impacts were incredibly loud, echoing through the small interior space of the habitat like a gunshot. The structural glass of the viewport vibrated violently under the blows. I could see the flecks in the seal. I fell to the floor, covering my head, waiting for the viewport to shatter and the ocean to flood the station, obliterating me in a single, unfeeling millisecond. But the glass held. The three thuds ended, and the pale fist slid back down out of the light beam, disappearing entirely into the freezing darkness of the trench. I scrambled back to the engineering console, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type. I fired up the text terminal and began typing in frantic, incoherent emergency evacuation request to the surface vessel. I told them that there was someone outside the station. I told them that the hull was compromised. I begged them to drop the rescue winch and pull the habitat back up to the surface immediately. I hit the transmit button, the screen flickered, and an automated red text box appeared across the interface. Transmission failed, outbound signal blocked by local interference. I ran to the diagnostic screen. The automated telemetry system showed that the main satellite uplink cable, which ran from the top of the habitat all the way up to floating relay buoy on the surface, had been physically severed. It wasn't a clean tear from an anchor or a jagged rock edge. The structural diagnostic logs indicated that the heavy, steel-reinforced cable had been slowly, repeatedly compressed over the last hour until the internal fiber optics collapsed. It had been squeezed to pieces by hand. I was completely cut off. I was alone, trapped inside a metal box 28,000 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean, with an impossible entity lurking just outside my walls. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute terror and psychological deterioration. I stopped turning the exterior floodlights on. I realized that the light didn't keep the thing away. It drew it closer. It wanted me to see it. It wanted me to know that it was watching. I sat in the absolute darkness of the central engineering workspace, the only illumination coming from the dull, red emergency power lights on the ceiling. The entity had stopped thumping on the glass. Now it was moving around the exterior skin of the habitat. I could hear the faint, metallic scrape of its long fingernails dragging slowly across the titanium hull plates. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was an agonizing, rhythmic sound that moved from the roof of my sleeping berth, down the side panels of the galley, and directly over to the life support ventilation intakes. Every time the thing passed over the intake valves, the air flowing into the habitat would change. It would lose its crisp, artificial quality and turn incredibly cold, heavy with the thick, suffocating smell of ancient, stagnant seawater and decaying organic matter. I had to wear my emergency oxygen mask just to breathe without vomiting from the stench. On the third night of the blackout, the scraping sounds stopped. I sat huddled on the floor of the console room, a heavy steel emergency wrench clutched in my white-knuckled grip, listening intently to the machinery. The silence returned, thicker and more terrifying than before. The pumps had slowed down, the geothermal tap was fluctuating, and the interior temperature had dropped to near freezing. My breath formed thick, white plumes in the red glow of the emergency lights. Suddenly, a soft, scratching sound echoed from inside the room. It wasn't coming from the exterior hull. It was coming from the floor beneath my knees. I looked down, my eyes widening with a fresh wave of panic. In the center of the engineering room was a heavy, circular steel emergency hatch. It was the entry trunk, designed to lock onto a deep-sea rescue vehicle if the station ever needed to be evacuated from below. The hatch was secured by a massive, triple-locking mechanical wheel that required hundreds of pounds of torque to turn. The heavy steel wheel was vibrating. Slowly, deliberately, the locking mechanism began to rotate. The internal gears groaned against the pressure, metal grinding against metal as the seals began to disengage. Click, click, click. I stood up, backing away toward the observation deck, my knees shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance. I raised the steel wrench over my head, preparing to fight whatever nightmare was coming through that deck plates. The mechanical wheel completed its full rotation with a loud, definitive snap. The heavy hatch began to lift upward, tilting open on its massive hinges. A thick, freezing column of black water didn't burst through the opening. The immense ocean pressure should have instantly flattened the room, but the physics of the trench had ceased to apply. Instead, a pool of perfectly still, pitch-black water filled the open trunk. The water was like liquid ink, completely undisturbed, reflecting the dull red glow of the emergency lights above. From the center of the black pool, two pale, skeletal hands slowly emerged, gripping the rim of the steel hatchway. The skin was completely translucent, the blue veins beneath visible like a map of decaying rivers. Slowly, a head began to rise out of the dark water. It had no hair. Its flesh was pulled incredibly tight across its skull, sharp and skeletal, completely bleached of any color. It had no nose, only two narrow vertical slits in the center of its face that exhaled a slow, freezing mist. And its eyes were massive, completely circular, and entirely black. They were like the eyes of a deep-sea shark, devoid of any irises or pupils, reflecting the red emergency light like two pools of blood. The entity pulled its long, emaciated torso out of the hatchway, its joints clicking loudly in the quiet room like snapping dry twigs. It didn't make a sound as its wet, pale feet touched the linoleum floor. It stood over 7 feet tall, its long arms dangling past its knees, its chest completely hollow. It didn't look at the console, and it didn't look at the machinery. Its massive, unblinking black eyes locked directly onto me. The air in the room became instantly unbreathable. The pressure in my ears skyrocketed, a loud, high-pitched ringing sound filling my skull until my nose began to bleed. I fell to my knees, dropping the steel wrench, my hands clapping over my ears as the intense agony of the sudden pressure change took over. The entity slowly took a step toward me. It didn't rush. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its long fingers twitching in the red light. As it drew closer, the low-frequency drone that I had recorded on the hydrophones weeks ago began to echo directly inside my brain. It wasn't a sound being heard by my ears. It was an acoustic frequency vibrating through the very fluid of my skull. It stood directly over me, its massive shadow blocking out the red emergency lights. I looked up, tears of pain and terror streaming down my cheeks, looking into those empty, abyssal eyes. The creature slowly raised its right hand, extending one long, ice-cold finger, and pressed it firmly against the center of my forehead. The moment its flesh touched mine, the control room vanished. I didn't see a monster anymore. I didn't see Station 7. My mind was instantly flooded with a wave of cosmic, ancient memories that didn't belong to me. I saw the ocean before the continents were formed. I saw the massive, prehistoric titans that used to swim in the sunlit waters before they were driven down into the dark by the changing world. I felt the absolute, crushing weight of millions of years of total darkness, total silence, and total isolation. The trench wasn't an empty canyon. It was a prison, a vast, underwater tomb for entities that had been forgotten by time itself, and they were lonely. They were so incredibly lonely. When I finally opened my eyes, the red emergency lights were gone. The bright, blinding glare of fluorescent tubes flooded my vision, causing a sharp, stinging pain in my retinas. I was lying on a gurney inside a medical bay, a thick plastic oxygen mask strapped to my face. A team of doctors and naval officers were standing over me, their faces grim, their voices muffled as they shouted instructions to one another. The surface crew had found me. According to the official logs, the research vessel had lost all contact with Station 7 for over 4 days. When they finally sent an automated recovery vehicle down to winch the habitat back up, they found the interior completely flooded with 2 feet of stagnant seawater. They found me lying unconscious on the observation deck floor, suffering from severe hypothermia, acute oxygen deprivation, and a level of decompression sickness that should have killed me instantly. They told me the station had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. They said a shifting boulder along the trench wall had crushed our satellite cable and cracked one of the secondary hull seals, causing a slow, freezing leak that filled the lower deck plates. They explained away everything I saw as a textbook case of deep-sea psychosis, a violent, hallucinatory break brought on by sensory deprivation, nitrogen narcosis, and carbon dioxide poisoning. I want to believe them. I try every single day to accept their logical, scientific explanations. I tell myself that the pale hand, the thumping on the glass, and the thing that climbed out of the emergency hatch were just the desperate fabrications of a dying, suffocating brain. But I know the truth. I've been out of the ocean for over a year now. I live in a landlocked desert city, miles away from any major body of water. But the isolation never truly leaves you once you've crossed the abyssal threshold. Every night, exactly at 3 in the morning, I wake up in a cold sweat. The air in my bedroom turns freezing cold, and the distinct, sickening smell of stagnant, ancient seawater fills the room. And if I sit perfectly still in the dark, listening to the quiet layout of my house, I can hear it. It's not coming from outside my window, and it's not coming from the street below. Deep within the drywall of my bedroom floor, right beneath my bed, comes the unmistakable, muffled sound of 3 heavy, rhythmic impacts. Thump, thump, thump. They didn't leave me down there in the dark. They just brought the trench back up with me.